Dow Meeting Archives, March 27th, 2016. The Easter Talk by Bill Bunting.
So everyone, let's go ahead and get started. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加恭敬分是一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever it is you happen to be today. It's a beautiful, sunny, warm day here in Indianapolis. Spring is in full bloom all over. It really is just a gorgeous day. We have a lilac bush in our backyard and a flowering dogwood next door that I can kind of look out at now at the back window, and oh my goodness, it just looks and smells wonderful. It is, of course, Easter Sunday, and so as it may be fitting, we probably should do the Easter talk about now. The Easter holiday is perhaps the holiest day in the entirety of the Judeo-Christian religious traditions. It definitely is to Christianity. Easter Sunday, of course, marks the day when Jesus was resurrected, when he rose from the tomb after the crucifixion. I'm pretty sure most everybody within earshot of me knows the story to one extent or another. For those who may not, this entire event actually begins on the holiday we call Good Friday, the day on which, historically speaking, or at least as the story goes, Jesus was crucified. According to the customs of the time, since no work could be performed on the Sabbath, which in the tradition in which Jesus grew up was Saturday, he was a Jewish rabbi, it was important both to the Romans to keep the peace and to the folks who cared for Jesus to have the crucifixion done with relatively quickly, so that he wouldn't be lingering about on the cross over the Sabbath. And so that precipitated the removal of his body without a lot of care taken to the preparations, and his burial in a borrowed tomb for the sake of quickness and brevity. And of course, over the Sabbath day, no work would have been done, and so nobody would have at least not from the Jewish tradition, would have taken care of any of the burial preparations or anything. That all would have been deferred until Sunday. According to the Bible, the Romans did position a couple of guards at the entrance to the tomb to prevent the followers of Jesus from kidnapping the body. And then, of course, on Easter Sunday, the women in charge of preparing Jesus for burial discovered that he was conspicuously absent. And following that, then the appearances to the various and sundry apostles and disciples started, and the resurrection tradition was born. And so that's the reason why the holiday is celebrated. The when probably has as much to do with the Celtic Sabbath of Astara, the spring Sabbath, as it does with when Jesus was actually crucified and resurrected. It's been the habit of various churches for millennia to cabbage on to other social events and traditions to perpetuate their teachings at times when their teachings were not necessarily the most popular of the day. In the early church, they competed with a number of different traditions, among which was Celtic paganism in Europe and Great Britain, and those pagan practices were well entrenched and well rooted. And so borrowing the holidays of, for instance, Yule for Christmas in the winter and Ostara for Easter in the spring gave the early church an opportunity to have a festival of some description during a time when people would normally be having a festival anyway of some sort. That's kind of the short version. And it begs the question, why talk about Easter? What's Easter got to do with the Tao teachings? Well, interestingly enough, most spiritual traditions cross paths with the Tao at some point. First and foremost, because we're really not an exclusive sort of a tradition, and second of all, because Taoist spirituality attempts to apply some answers to some of the same questions that every other spiritual tradition does, albeit perhaps in a somewhat different vein. At the end of the day, most spirituality tries to answer the question, what happens to us when we die? What's the question of human immortality? Is there a soul? Is there a part of us that transcends this existence? Is there a reason for our existence beyond the 70 years that we spend running around on this planet trying to figure out the answers to our lives? There's every conceivable answer to that question, from absolutely not to, yep, we're immortal and uniquely special, and everything in between. And I guess it's not really for me to recommend to you or suggest to you what you should believe, but perhaps to share some of the various possibilities and some of the cornucopia of possible answers for your consideration, as you consider your own spiritual path. We talk about the resurrection of Jesus in a near mythical light, and yet in the West in particular, we tend to regard the potential for the reincarnation of the human spirit at large to be a much more dubious event. On the next slide, I'm going to ask the question outright, why is resurrection taken to be, in the Christian tradition, factual, and reincarnation as impossible? But that's really the question. Yeah. If there is, in fact, a human spirit that transcends the death event, why is it impossible for that spirit to be reincarnated? Why is it any less likely that my true self, my spiritual form, might not come back here into a different body, a different existence, a different lifetime, than it is that at my death that spirit would be snatched away to some kind of judgment, after which some kind of determination about eternal glorification or punishment would be made. Right now in the media, all manner of spiritual phenomena are just unbelievably popular. Ghosts, spirits, angels, even vampires, demons, and things that used to be considered monstrous in the days not so long ago are just the height of TV and media everywhere. You can't turn the TV on without finding somebody who's typically a whole bunch better looking than I am chasing down a demon or a vampire or a werewolf or something, or investigating some kind of a paranormal sighting or phenomena in a house or building someplace. It's all the rage. And yet the serious consideration of what may cause those things, at least from a spiritual perspective, to exist or not, hardly ever gets treated. The fantastical aspects are as popular as they can possibly be. The serious spiritual study, much less so. I'm not sure I understand that, except that perhaps the serious study of resurrection and reincarnation is way thin on demonstrable fact and not nearly as sexy as television would portray. And yet it goes to the very core of the ultimate question of our existence. It's an interesting set of questions to consider. And so why is it that in the West we've been conditioned to accept the resurrection of one individual as a factual occurrence, and yet we can't bring ourselves to consider the reincarnation of the human spirit as a possibility? If we go back in the Old Testament, for instance, to various stories that we're all familiar with, there are occasions where angels and spiritual beings have appeared to human beings on earth and told them that something was going to happen. It said that Noah heard the voice of God directly, that Noah walked with God, that Moses walked with God. When it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, however, Lot is visited by angels who tell he and his family to escape the cities and not look back because they were about to be destroyed. These folks appeared at Lot's door in physical form. Not only could Lot see them and bring them into his home, but the people that lived around him could see them. And it is widely speculated that one of the reasons that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed was not so much for their sexual sin, but for the violation of the law of hospitality. That the people of the city wanted to misuse Lot's visitors, and Lot would not permit that to occur. And that things of that nature so angered God that he decided to lay waste to both cities. The Old Testament is decidedly mum on what actually the sinful nature and evil nature of Sodom and Gomorrah were, but whatever it was, the visitation, according to the Old Testament, occurred. Lot and his daughters survived. His wife was turned into a pillar of salt, and Sodom and Gomorrah were summarily destroyed. So what were the angels? Isn't it possible, perhaps, that the angels might have been people who lived once here? Folks who were good and worthy people and volunteered for or were pressed into service as messengers of the divine? Why not? Why is it any more unlikely that those spiritual presences would be artificial creations and not reincarnations? Why is it that it's unreasonable for me to think that I might one day give up this physical body and come back around sometime later and pick up a different one? There are cases in both near-death experience and in the experience of some people where they have knowledge of past existences of facts and places and people that there is absolutely no way in the world they could have had or could have acquired through any means other than some kind of pre-knowledge. That is, their opportunities and circumstances never led those lives to the places and events that they're able to recount. In one case, a 4-year-old kid recalled vividly having been a World War II fighter pilot in such detail that they were actually able to go back and find his name and his squadron and all sorts of other information. And although it's probably difficult on the part of the government and the families to accept that as proof, the evidence is certainly somewhat compelling. I'd find it rather unusual for a 4-year-old to be able to make up that kind of detail. Perhaps the best evidence for these events is the selection of the Dalai Lama, where once again a child who's far too young to have a constructed avarice and deception is caused by examination to reveal whether or not he has the knowledge of the previous Dalai Lama. And the selection process is rigorous. It would certainly be a feat if that selection process could be deceived in some way. I know part of it involves placing the child in front of a whole bunch of possessions, some of which belong to the previous Dalai Lama, and the child has to identify them all correctly. And that in and of itself would pretty much convince me that there's more to this than deception. I just don't know how anybody'd ever pull that off. But can you prove it for sure? Well, okay, no, probably not. So what's the most likely truth? What can we say out of this discussion? What's the common thread? Well, for me, I have to believe, and once again, my opinion only, that every sentient being is spiritual in nature, and that human beings are not the only sentient beings on this planet. I've said before, I'm absolutely convinced our dogs are sentient. They are. I know they feel joy, they feel fear, they can feel pain, they can be happy, they dream, which is really something to watch. I'm not sure what they dream about, but whatever it is, it's exciting for them. If that isn't sentience, I'm not sure what is. Can they contemplate their own existence? I'm not sure. I don't know to what extent they're aware, but they certainly are aware of their existence and their surroundings, and to an extent are emotional beings. So I have to give them the benefit of thinking they're sentient. I think respect for all life is not a weakness. It's not a frivolity. It's not the carte blanche, never kill anything ever respect for life. There are times, as we've discussed here before, where occasionally killing is necessary. If my house becomes infested with termites or hornets, they got to go, you know. Not because I revel or take joy in the killing, but because I'm allergic to hornets and I just as soon not have my house eaten by termites. Still, being able to respect the skill with which hornets can construct a paper nest, or termites can construct the abodes in which they live, and some of those things are impressive. gives me pause, perhaps not to consider their intelligence, but to consider their specialness in the universe, their little unique niche that no other creature can quite fill. I'd appreciate it if they wouldn't eat my house or kill me, but that aside, I think it's pretty cool that they exist. And so I don't have a huge problem with accepting the spiritual nature of all sentient beings. I think that for me is not much of a stretch. And I don't have a problem with accepting reincarnation as a possibility. When I weigh out the different sides of the discussion, for me, it isn't too much of a choice. When I look at the various theological traditions that are ensconced in judgment or some kind of mercy based on some ethereal entity that I don't have any control over, I find that somewhat difficult to take. I find some of the theological inconsistencies a little difficult to swallow. Case in point, in the Old Testament, there's a story of the prophet Elijah and the children of Baal. Baal was a god of sorts to folks that lived near the land of Canaan. Elijah was a Jewish prophet. Elijah came to know of the children of Baal because of their practice of sacrificing their children by burning them alive. And this, of course, promulgated one of the best-known Old Testament children's stories that's ever been written, where God tells Elijah to go tell the practitioners of this practice that it was an abomination for them to burn their children up alive, and that Elijah was to go to them and tell them to build an altar, and he'd do likewise, and they'd see whose God was greater. And so, and Elijah built his altar and then soaked his in water. And after a very brief series of prayers, of course, Elijah's altar was consumed by the God of the Israelites, thereby putting an end to the practice of burning the children of Baal up alive in a fire. Now, in the New Testament throughout, I'm informed at every conceivable turn that the fact that I exist means I'm sinful, and the fact that I'm sinful means that I'm going to hell. And going to hell is described in Hebrew and Greek both as being cast into the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom was a real honest-to-goodness geographical place outside the city of Jerusalem where the trash was burned, and the fire there never went out. The average first-century Jewish person would have known clearly what that reference meant. And so here we are in the New Testament threatening a judgment on people that God says in the Old Testament's an abomination. The children of Baal eventually were out of pain, at least. Well, it's a horrible, you die. If you go to hell, the pain never stops. I have a tough time finding the justice there. I compare that with the philosophy of karma, which can be extremely painful at times, owing to the degree of resistance I decide to apply to learning a particular lesson, but not unjust. There are times in my life where I truly wished that my resistance to the karmic path and my desire to delusionally kid myself into believing that there was some kind of external influence at work there might have been correct. But the truth of the matter is my karmic path has always been the result of my own choices. And the bricks that have hit me in the face in my life have always hit me in the face because I refuse to get out of the way. Is that hell? Well, sometimes, but it isn't permanent, and it's changeable because we can learn. And okay, sometimes I learn slowly, but I do learn. I look at the lessons of karma and the path of the Tao teachings and the things that I can observe in my life and in the lives of others, and to me this makes sense. Could I be dead wrong? Absolutely. I could die tomorrow and find out that I'm going to burn for all eternity. And if that happens, boy, I'm sure going to hate it. And I apologize in advance for being wrong. But to my thinking, it just doesn't work that way. What I can observe tells me that it just doesn't work that way. Nobody ever comes by here, burns my house down, and shoots my kids and says, I did that because I know better than you. Nobody ever comes by here and punishes me simply because I exist, because I was born in some way flawed. Just doesn't happen. Over the years of my life, I've occasionally made a couple of people mad, but even they didn't come burn my house down. Even amongst people who are remarkably small-minded and selfish and needy and emotionally overwrought, we seem to be able to muster in ourselves the ability to give another person a break when we know they're trying, and the restraint to not cause irreparable damage or kill them when we think they're wrong. I have to believe that that part of our higher self is nurtured in our spirituality. I think that's part of the karmic path in the Tao teachings. I think that's part of the laws of nature. So, like I said at the beginning, this talk isn't to tell you what to believe. I'm not trying to persuade, convert, or proselytize anybody. But it is Easter Sunday, and I think it's important from time to time to consider the ethereal nature of our existence, the spiritual nature of our path, and to pay that some attention and deference. I think understanding our karmic path is central to mastering the Tao teachings. And so I thought perhaps a somewhat whimsical but dead serious discussion on where that path may lead was appropriate. I think we got to consider our karmic path and the consequences of our choices. I talk about the consequences of our choices near every week, because I believe it's our choices and the consequences of those choices that determine where our path goes. I think it's important for us to consider the possibility that all life on this planet is spiritual in nature, whether it's sentient or not, and that respecting that life is something that's worthy of doing, and that it's not overly passive or a sign of strength or weakness or inability to cope because we choose either not to or we absolutely cannot bring ourselves to end it or to cause suffering. And in fact, I believe there's absolutely no downside to a life lived trying to end suffering, to relieve pain, to help others, whether the others we're helping are humans or animals or whatever. And so hopefully that message will prove to be useful to someone, and perhaps it'll be helpful. In any event, thank you for letting me share with you, and have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，持架三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持架护顶是一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are all done.
Join the Tao meeting live to participate in the questions and commentary. For more information, go to http://taoism.net/tao/connect-online.